So, a couple of months ago, I completed my first novel. My novel is set in Port Harcourt, in southern Nigeria, and it somehow looks at the treatment of LGBTQI minorities in Nigeria, particularly in the aftermath of the anti-gay law that was signed by the Nigerian government in 2014. Shortly after this novel was acquired for publication, I was having a chat with a friend, and he expressed some mixed feelings towards the novel. On one hand, he was quite happy with some aspects of it, but why, he wanted to know, had I decided to tackle the topic of queerness, particularly from a sympathetic standpoint. In the course of this conversation, he went on to make his argument, which was mostly that African literature ought to be a tool to propagate African values to a wider audience. And so for this reason, he felt that certain concepts needed not to be written about, as they were fundamentally in opposition to true African values. By choosing, therefore, to center queerness in my narrative, my acquaintance was of the opinion that I was betraying my cultural beliefs and pandering to a larger non-African audience. And for this reason, he was disappointed by what he called my willingness to trade my African values for Western validation. Now, as unfortunate as this sentiment might seem, it was not entirely new to me. In fact, over the years, I've had to contend variations of this argument, mainly from African and Afrocentered academics. You see, the feeling I had come to understand by now was that certain progressive identity constructs, such as queerness or even feminism, were not only regarded as exclusively Western, but also fundamentally in opposition to true African values. And so basically, any art or literature engaging these, even if created by an African, were regarded as anti-African Western propaganda. Still, this conversation with my friend stayed with me, and it made me revisit the question I find myself increasingly asking: what exactly are African values? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines values as a people's collective principle or standard of behavior. To understand the people's values is to inquire about what they place collective importance on. What sort of rules guide relations among people in a community? Values and norms are intertwined concepts. While values are abstract ideals we hold, norms are a patterned manifestation of these ideals. Together, they make for uniformity in public conduct, and often in a positive way. They make for cohesion and coexistence, which in turn generates a certain degree of order in a society. Now, values and norms, when they endure, become culture. Of course, we know that culture is important in that it gives people a feeling of pride in their identity and a sense of belonging to a community. All of this is really to establish the fact that we do require values in our communities for our collective progress. So what about African values? Africa is a large continent with over 51 countries, housing nearly 1/5 of the world population. Now, while each of these countries are truly distinct, we do have some similarities among us. And I dare say one of those similarities would be our cultural value systems. If I were, for instance, to walk into a random African classroom and pose this question, similar examples of African values provided would be the value for life, respect for elders and those in constituted authority, a solid belief in hard work, reverence for language and religion, and someone might say something potentially controversial like spanking children for misbehavior. Africans take great pride in our values, and we can be very passionate about them. Because Africa is a continent with a history of having our affairs dictated by outsiders through colonialism and neocolonialism, it's sort of easy to understand why we tend to cling dearly to what we believe in. I sometimes think of it as a sort of trauma response, a defiance, if you please. We consider our values to be the one thing that is truly up to us to determine. And so it's sort of easy to understand why we tend to get very defensive in the face of even perceived threats of Western influence. Now, like my acquaintance mentioned earlier on, many Africans today regard the West with mixed feelings. And my very imperfect equivalent is the sort of feeling you have towards a handsome dog that belongs to a stranger. There's so much to admire, but at the same time, there's just as much to be wary of. When I was accepted to study here at WashU, my parents were very proud. And some members of my extended family would basically tell anyone who cared to listen that their boy was going to America. However, in addition to this excitement was concern that I would become Americanized, pick up foreign culture, and gradually become a person they no longer recognized. Now, they mean well, and at the end of the day, they really just want what is best. But this concern somehow speaks to what I recognize as a peculiarly African perception of the West as a place of moral depravity. I must admit that up until recently, I also bought into the school of thought. I also saw the West as a place where morals become tainted, and Africa as the exact opposite, a place where morals were preserved. But increasingly, I find myself questioning the metrics by which we Africans determine and measure what is moral and what isn't. And more often than not, the irony isn't lost on me. I know, for instance, a Nigerian couple from my hometown who live continents apart and only see each other every other few years because the man is reluctant to relocate with his wife to the US on the grounds that she would become corrupted by America. Now, this is a sentiment that is shared by an astonishing number of people back home. The thing is, whenever I hear the word corrupt used in this context, I often unconsciously assume a more sinister outcome. Maybe when they say America would corrupt these women, what they mean is that America might turn these women into drug traffickers, or even worse, serial killers. But the truth is, when they say America would corrupt these women, what they mean is that in America, away from home, these women might likely come into an acknowledgement of the full spectrum of their basic human dignity, and thereby rebel against age-long regressive norms. And what is more frightening to the patriarchy than a woman who finally finds her voice? Still, this concern over Western influence on African values does not exist in a vacuum, neither is it completely irrational. History, after all, informs us that Western colonization of the African continent did have its effects, not just on the geographic, economic, and political climate of Africa today, but also in social terms, including its value systems. Historians and sociologists researching these effects, some of whom are wholly Afrocentric, have posited that some of what is today regarded and defended as indigenous African values are in fact not indigenous at all. And on the flip side, some of what is today resisted as a colonial import did have traces in pre-colonial Africa. My very good friend, Rose, is from the Ijaw ethnic group in southern Nigeria, and I recently learned that she, like many others from that ethnic group, traces her lineage from the maternal side, a practice that existed long before colonial rule. Now, this matriarchal family unit contrasts the patriarchy of today. We also know, of course, of marriages between women in pre-colonial Igbo land, as in many other parts of Africa, the reasons for them notwithstanding. These practices were among many that were abolished by the British colonial government for being barbaric. So how is it that today we can, without the sense of irony, reject the idea of women in power as being un-African, or suggest that unions between people of the same sex was a recent colonial import? But even if we were to momentarily agree with the indigenousness or otherwise of African values as they have come to be defined today, the point remains that African societies are part of a global community. And like every other member of that community, we do get to be judged by, among other indices, our treatment of minorities, of outliers, and of those who do not conform to a narrow definition of what normal is. And on this front, we have very sadly been found wanting. A couple of videos have gone viral on Nigerian social media over the years, but I'd like today to draw our attention to two of them. One of them, which went viral about 2 years ago, showed a father beating up his teenage daughter. Now, apparently, news of this girl's relationship with another girl had gone viral, and this father thought it was a good idea to physically take it out on her. This video sparked a debate on Nigerian Twitter on whether the father's actions were justified or not. Unfortunately, but quite unsurprisingly, the consensus was overwhelmingly in favor of the father. And I remember going through the comment section, and most of the comments praised him for taking the initiative of reinforcing true African values in his child. The second incident was that of a young gay man who had been lured by 2 other men to a location where he was robbed and ultimately beaten to death. These tragedies are merely a handful in what continues to be an unending cycle of sometimes fatal violence targeted at queer people all over Africa. But what has always stuck out for me in the aftermath of these events are the responses of other Africans, some of whom might be grudgingly opposed to the excessive brutality, but hold the opinion that these victims are somewhat culpable in their own attacks. Because how dare these victims try to be themselves here in Africa, the very place they call home? And many queer Africans are familiar with the situation where they are told to go to America whenever they try to assert their rights to be alive. Now, I wish it were simply easy to wake up in the morning and just go to America, but I'm pretty sure immigration doesn't work that way. But more than that, this go to America sentiment assumes that the West is a bastion of complete freedom and tolerance, and that minorities in the West are living their best lives. But while I can't claim to be an authority on the workings of the West, what I do know for sure is that change, by its very nature, is often scary, and that the instinct towards any kind of difference in any community, be it a small conservative town in Nigeria or a big liberal city in America, is often resistant. I know that no society has a monopoly on hate, just as I know that tolerance and acceptance is not the exclusive preserve of any community. And so it shouldn't be on African to say that people deserve not to be killed or arrested or harassed for who they are. Arguing that people deserve to be accorded full dignity and freedom to exist in their own homelands should not be considered Western propaganda. Whenever I have these conversations with friends, a common response provided is a shrug that says, well, African culture is African culture. And what is often implied is that these cultures are set in stone and ultimately unchangeable. But we know, by its very definition, that culture at the end of the day is simply what we collectively say it is. Culture exists not for its own benefit. It is meant to advance the people, not to hold them back. And so while we strive to uphold our values, and we should, we need to be open to the question of how much of these values are compatible with our rapidly changing world. How much of them are advancing us as originally intended or holding us back? And even if we were to say, well, the us being referred to is really a small minority, since when did that become less relevant? Since when did we become a people disinterested in the principle of injustice to one is injustice to all? Of what use are some of our values if they exist fundamentally as tools of oppression and marginalization, if they make us hurt our own? And speaking of evolving values, even today within the African continent, there are many countries making deliberate efforts towards fostering greater inclusivity. And there are even many more headed in that direction. While Nigeria and Morocco struggle with equal and equitable gender participation in politics, countries like Rwanda are setting standards for nations around the world. As Kenya and Uganda move to strengthen harmful laws against LGBTQI individuals, countries like Lesotho and Botswana have decriminalized these laws with a goal for greater human rights advancement. None of these countries are more African than the other. It is up to the rest of us today to decide what path we want to take. On what side of history do we want to belong? Full respect for all human beings should not have to be in opposition to our values. Choosing to expand our value system with a goal for more inclusivity should not have to mean stripping it of its originality. Instead of viewing this vast, vital human rights issue as a mere case of the West versus Africa, how about we choose instead to look inwards and come to an informed decision based solely on that very lovely and wise Igbo principle of Ibili Muabili, you get to live and I get to live. How about we choose to view this as an undertaking owed to the underprivileged in our societies? Who doesn't want to live in a world that is truly fair and just for all? Speaking of evolving values, even today, there are countries that are making deliberate efforts towards fostering greater inclusivity. Now, there are people who are concerned that the fight for more equality, simply because it is, in fairness, spearheaded by Western organizations, is simply another Western ploy to exert influence over Africans and consequently strip us of agency. I want to see the merit in this argument, but my problem with it has always been that it is, at its core, exclusionary, and that it fails to admit some fundamental home truths. Because to say, for instance, that the global campaign for greater gender equality is un-African is to imply that women in Africa, unlike women in other parts of the world, are singularly undeserving of equality. And this is something I simply cannot agree with. Because the truth, at the end of the day, is that women in Africa are just as human as women in any part of the world, just as deserving of every opportunity and access as any other. The truth is that queer people exist in Africa, and no amount of erasure, either in our minds or in the laws we enact, is going to change this fact. And so here's a response I wish I had provided to my acquaintance at the end of that conversation many months ago. Queer Africans are just as African as the next person, and those stories are just as deserving as any other to be told. Thank you.